Hi everyone, welcome. So as you can hear, I just started the recording. The first hour of this event is going to be recorded. If you'd like to protect your privacy, you can always turn off your video and even rename yourself with an alias if you'd like. We still have some more people joining us, but I'm just going to get started with some housekeeping notes so that we have plenty of time for the workshop. So thank you for joining us for this artist statement workshop with Shama Rahman. My name is Wendy and I'm the program's associate at Q. Just a few notes to go over before we get started. Live captions are available tonight. If you click on the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. As I just mentioned, the first hour is going to be recorded. And then in the second hour, we're going to be going into breakout groups, so that portion is not going to be recorded. We also, Shama is going to be showing a worksheet or two, and that will be available as a resource later. So now to introduce Shama. Shama is a brand marketer, workshop facilitator, and creative consultant from New York. She is the director of brand strategy at New York Magazine. Previously, she has worked as a creative strategist at the Wall Street Journal and in brand marketing roles at the New York Times, the Whitney Museum of Art, and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. Shama is also a founding member of Nine Stream Collective and a former board member of the South Asian Women's Creative Collective. So with that, would you like to take it away, Shama?
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Wendy and Q, for having me. And thanks everyone here for giving up your evening to work on your artist statements. I think that's a great first step for all of us. And yeah, just to go through kind of like how we're structuring this, as Wendy mentioned, the first hour is recorded. We're going over 2 worksheets. We'll have some time for questions, and then we'll do a little bit of a super short live demonstration about how I recommend just kind of like approaching any existing documents you might have. We'll also do a short 10-minute writing exercise just to get kind of like our ideas flowing, and then go into the next hour where we'll move into small groups. And I will just kind of circulate around the small groups and spend some like one-on-one time with everybody as much as possible. And then at the end, we'll just wrap up, come together, and if any final questions come up, just address those as a group. Okay, so I will share my screen. And as Wendy mentioned, I will send a link to the document afterwards, so no need to take screenshots or just copious amounts of notes. Okay, so when we think about writing artist statements, and the reason that I started doing this workshop is it felt overwhelming for a lot of visual artists and performance artists and artists and creatives of kind of any media who don't enjoy writing about themselves. So I thought it would be helpful to just kind of like get back to the basics a little bit and think about the fact that an artist and creative statement is really a general introduction to your work, body of work, or specific project. It's not a biography, and it's really about your personal relationship to your practice. So it speaks to the viewer in your absence, and it's recommended that you write it from a first person point of view because it is that personal. Instead of writing about how the viewer should interpret your work, share what you actually think of it. You're allowed to include things that resonate with you from other folks. If somebody says something and it really appeals, like definitely include that. But it's really not about having outside sources dictate your relationship to the practice and dictate the words that you kind of use. And then, why do we have artist statements? Why do we want to prioritize that? There's a deadline coming up for Q. So being prepared with a statement in advance will really help you take advantage of opportunities whenever they come up. And it's always better, I think, to kind of stay ready instead of having to get ready under a stressful deadline very close to it. So what I recommend when we think about the writing process for artist statements is really to take like 5 days. So if you have a week that you can work on it and just break it up into a couple pieces, it's really helpful. So you would do like a pre-writing phase and then take a break. You do a draft day and then, give yourself some space after that. And then it would be a post-writing. Another thing that I thought we should cover, and we can talk about specifics about this, including Wendy can kind of like weigh in. We recommend having a couple of like lengths just like available, depending on the deadline and kind of like the kinds of context that you're working towards. But, having a couple at different lengths just helps you be prepared. For example, if you have something that's 500 words long, and then you have something 250 words, and then you have a project statement that maybe is 100 words. Let's say an application comes up and you have to write 300 words about it. So much easier to edit 250 words to expand to 300 rather than having to just go back to this super long, more detailed statement and reduce down from 500 words. And the opposite can also be true. When you are applying to something that's like 400 words or 600 words, it feels easier to work on that when you already have the majority of an artist statement finished that's like closer in word count. So the 3 lengths that I recommend just like as a starting point, one is a full page statement that speaks generally about your work, the methods you've used, and the history of your practice, possibility of details regarding your current project. So that's 500 words, and then a short statement that's about 250 words that includes the above in an abbreviated way, and then short project statement maybe about a specific project you wish to present. So it could be what you're working on right now, or it could be a series or part of your portfolio that you feel like needs a separate dedicated statement that your overall statement just kind of doesn't speak to or might need more detail. So when we think about the pre-writing questions and the pre-writing phase, what I recommend is opening up any kind of just blank document. Try to take away the urge to write full sentences and to think about grammar and formatting and just like very specific language that you want to use and include in the final version of your statement. And really just think about like the following questions. And I would just free write all of this. So why are you writing the statement? Who will read the statement? What assumptions are you making about the reader's existing knowledge? That really varies. So if you're writing for your website or you're writing for a particular grant or residency, all of those places will have different types of audiences. And so you have to kind of think about speaking to those audiences in different ways, or perhaps you don't need to, but it could be a factor in how you phrase things. Where will the statement live? Is it online? Is it public? Is it private? Just kind of thinking about for your own, comfort level, how vulnerable do I feel good being in the statement? What do you want the statement to say about you and your work? What is the desired takeaway, and what is the desired takeaway from the statement? So a lot of these questions, sometimes it's easy to just say, oh, I'm applying to something and has this deadline, that's why I'm writing this. But then when we think about, what do you want the statement to say? And then what's the desired takeaway? Sometimes those questions just kind of feel very intimidating and make you just stop a little bit. And so if you feel stuck, there are a couple of writing exercises at the bottom, and we'll actually do one of these a little bit later. But I would say, if you feel really like there's like a block between you and kind of talking about your practice and your experience, I would set a timer for 10 minutes. All of these recommendations were from Micah. And, within 10 minutes, just get started writing about like, what does it look like? Size, color, shapes, textures, etc. for your work. It could be about your body of work, or if you feel more comfortable starting with a particular piece, it could just start there. What inspired the piece? What's the impetus? What are the concepts, themes, and emotions that are kind of related to the work? Is there a central or guiding image or idea? Different elements, different processes, different materials. How does the work use space or relate to the surrounding space? All of those questions, I think, kind of break down the two bigger questions in this pre-writing phase a bit more, and hopefully get you started. And then the other recommendation is if you feel intimidated or uncomfortable starting alone or even answering those questions, and you would rather have it start with a conversation, maybe you could invite some friends or like trusted colleagues or trusted peers, like who you're in conversation with, for a virtual studio visit, and just record the conversation. See how you answer questions that they ask you about your work, and then also see what questions come up more repeatedly. And think about just kind of like what feels like a very natural like response when you're not worried about the artist statement. I think just thinking about like how you talk about it in everyday conversation is a really helpful place to start. So once you've done the pre-writing, I would really encourage you to give yourself a day of break, just step away from it. And I think hopefully it makes it a little bit less intimidating and jarring when you go to the draft phase. So when I'm thinking about the actual writing process for this, instead of thinking about a specific number of words or sentences that need to be dedicated to each part of your artist statement, what I would say is thinking about it in ratios. So the first quarter, really thinking about an overview, showcasing the basic ideas behind your work, body of work, or specific project. Try not to include details just yet, just kind of introducing folks to your practice. The second 25% is kind of building up like upon that, and trying to start including like the how and the what, specific details that show how the broad ideas mentioned in the beginning of the statement are represented in your work. Thinking about special processes, any unusual materials, or just kind of like building on that foundation, and setting the stage for folks to think about why you have a practice and like why you're interested in making this work. So the third 25% really covers that. What are some themes, influences, motivation, any current or historical events, subject matter, etc., that might have led you to choose this path and practice and media. And I know this part is like the hardest part. So I think if you want to break that down even further and then kind of pick out from each category of like theme, influences, motivation, and then see what you actually want to include in the final, I think that makes total sense. And then the last 25%, it's really not a summary sentence, but I think it's just important to remember that folks are reading so many statements. If it's for an application, everyone's reading a lot of statements at once. Or if folks are finding your work on a website, they might be reading a lot of other articles or other web pages. So just thinking about like, what are some of the most important things that you want your statement to leave somebody with? It doesn't have to be a summary of everything you included, but just kind of thinking about the last part as like an ending that feels right for you, and kind of like one important takeaway that you might want to leave folks with. So once you've done the draft phase, again, I really encourage everyone to take a break if they can, a full day, just to give yourself some breathing room. And then you kind of go into the post-writing questions. So here, by this point, you will have a document with answers to your pre-writing questions and any brainstorming that you might have done. You have a second document that is your draft. So during the post-writing question phase, you're really thinking about, okay, compared to what I intended to do during pre-writing and the actual draft, how much of it came across, and did the most important things that I wanted to prioritize come through in the actual statement? So, does your statement achieve the goals listed during your pre-writing phase? Thinking about grammatical errors and typos, their Grammarly is really helpful for that, but then also just thinking about turning to peers, if there's someone trusted that you can go to read it, review it. Thinking about formatting, that's mostly for applications. We just don't want the formatting to be the reason that your application is kind of turned away, or just, I don't want to say disqualified, but just kind of thinking about if there is any specific formatting, just like making sure it reaches that, doesn't meet the requirements of your audience. So this is really where we're thinking about who is the audience. Did I write in approachable, accessible language to that particular audience. If you are applying to something where folks who are reviewing it might have more like specific backgrounds that mirror that, like where they have a lot of like specific knowledge about your particular processes, or if something's more, if they have like the technical background that matches like the techniques that you're doing, then you can make it more technical. But if you're thinking about a broader audience where folks might not have any context for the work that you're doing, just thinking about that and thinking about like how much of, how much detail you want to go into process wise or otherwise that makes sense to them. And then, does it read as professional and objective even with the first person narrative? So when we talk about this part, it's really thinking about your own vulnerability and your own comfort level. It does not have to be more personal than you feel comfortable putting out. This is something that I feel like it comes up in every workshop. There are a lot of parts about our different identities, different backgrounds, different experiences. Maybe it influences our creative practice, but we just don't want to tell people about it. And that's totally okay to omit. It's really about you, your relationship to your practice, and, just thinking about the word like professional. I don't mean it as like gatekeeping or you have to speak in a particular jargon, especially in the art world. But it's really just like for you, what feels like a good comfort level for you to write this where another person might read it. So, that's like the end of it. And when we talk about this artist statement workshop and this process, it's really about taking you to a middle ground to get you from maybe being like totally intimidated of writing something or having a draft that might need some work and getting it, like further and closer to like kind of an end product. This workshop is not meant to give you an artist statement that will be the, end all be all, and you're never going to touch your artist statement for the rest of your practice. It's an ongoing process, and you have to revisit it and kind of think about as your practice evolves, as you are evolving as an artist, how are things changing? Does the artist statement still fit? So I think it's just important to remember that this is all a work in progress. But hopefully this gets you to a point where you feel comfortable kind of like putting something forward for other folks to read. And then just to end it on some like words of wisdom that I think is really helpful for folks to remember. There's an self-conscious language about your work, which you use all the time. Every time you talk or think about your work, you experience relationship between words and your art. The trick is really to learn how to catch yourself doing this and then faithfully writing it down. So if you can, anytime you're talking about your practice, anytime you're talking about your work, just kind of notice the words that you're using when you don't feel under the pressure of like putting it onto paper and then submitting it somewhere. That might really help in kind of leading you to including it in your statement. So I'm going to stop sharing for now, just for a moment, and then open it up to any initial questions that come up. I don't know, Wendy, if anyone had sent any questions. Oh, yeah, I think questions in the chat would be great. Or if you want to raise your hand, I can call on you and you can ask it live also. Okay, great. Kiana.
Thank you so much for all the tips. That's been really helpful. I have a question for when you're writing an artist statement for somebody who does a lot of interdisciplinary work, so a lot of different projects, like how do you, it's kind of hard to talk about like the techniques or the material when you're working with a lot of things. I was wondering if you have any tips for that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question and one that comes up a lot for sure. And what I would say is I would start thinking about kind of like what are the threads and themes that like connect the different parts of your practice and the different parts of your work, and seeing if there's a way to kind of like thread a line and like using that as like the umbrella rather than focusing so much about like super specific techniques for each part of your practice. And then maybe you can kind of include like just naming the parts of your like naming the disciplines. But I would just go back to thinking about like, okay, well, what is like kind of pushing me to make work like across these disciplines? Is there anything that kind of connects it all? And then going from there. Okay, great. So Lee, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
That was really helpful already. Thank you. And I love the idea of the recording a conversation while you're talking, because I definitely feel like when I'm talking about my work, it's like, oh, that was smart. Like that sounded really good. So I have a terrible artist statement already. And like your suggestions of maybe of the pre-writing sounded like they kind of started from like a blank slate. Would you suggest that even if you already kind of have an artist statement that is not very good, like what do you do with like a bad one, and then do you just kind of start fresh? Do you have suggestions?
That's a great question, because what we're actually going to do is, even for any writing that you already have, there is a process that I'm going to just show to like break it down so that you can apply kind of like the separate sections to, you know, just to see like where you are right now and then what can you carry over. So you might be able to kind of break down your artist statement as it is. And I also think, you know, I understand the impulse to be like, it's so bad right now. But, you know, the fact that you wrote something, the fact that you like put time into it, I think it's like a starting point, you know, like I think it's just kind of like, it's much better than you think it is, just kind of like because it helped you get to like the next phase. But yeah, so what I would recommend is if you have an artist statement, you're not too happy about it, we'll go through and kind of like show how to break it down, see maybe there are some things that you're like, okay, I would like to keep a little bit of this, even if it's like half a sentence. And then what are parts that feel like holes? And then you can also go into like, and then do the questions, right? So you have like a little bit of like a combined pre-writing phase, and then you can kind of like go into the draft mode.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. But I think it's actually great for anyone who already has writing, even if you scrap it, just like as a starting point, draft one.
Thank you.
Of course. Great questions. Okay. So Irene asked, do you know of any examples of artist statements that people should take a look at? This is a great question and comes up a lot. I think, unfortunately, because everyone's practice is so different, and when we look at other folks' artist statements, it's hard to say like, this is, you know, categorically like an excellent one that everyone should look at. It feels, especially for artists, like it just doesn't apply. Like it's not like quite the right, it might not be the right framework, but we are going to do an like a little bit of an exercise where we can just kind of show, you know, like what we could improve on like an existing artist statement. And I think any of them kind of could use improvement for sure. And it's kind of always a work in progress. So unfortunately, no like exact examples right now. Any other questions? So if questions come up, also like feel free to put it in the chat, and then we will just be doing like a little bit of an exercise in a little bit, so we can we can just like discuss as it happens. Okay, so what I was thinking is if we can do a 10-minute brainstorming exercise. So I will put it up on the screen again, and this is just to get everyone, you know, like thinking. You can either start thinking about the different percentages and kind of like going into that. You can think about the pre-writing questions. I'm going to put a link to the document in the chat so everyone has it. And then also put on the screen. So with this 10 minutes, I would say you can either do the pre-writing questions, or if you want to look at the 10-minute writing exercise that Micah, kind of recommended, that's like pre-writing, you can do that too. But it's just to get your mind kind of going. So I will put that here. Okay, so here are the pre-writing questions. And then here are some of like the questions to get you started for if that feels too soon. And I put the link in the chat also, so you have the document. And I'm just gonna start a timer right now. So if you feel more comfortable turning off your video, and yeah, we'll reconvene at 7:09. All right. So that was exactly 10 minutes. Did anyone feel like that was very long? Or did anything come up during that just like period that we want to discuss before we move on to the next thing? Yeah, it feels really long. And I think that's also really helpful for us to remember as we just kind of like move through this process, that you don't need hours and hours and hours to kind of like dedicate and to prolong kind of like putting it off. Even 10 minutes can really feel like you're making progress. Okay, so what I wanted us to kind of like go through is I just pulled a artist statement off of a website that just kind of like had some examples, and I wanted to show how we might approach live editing, and kind of like what questions we would ask like during the process. So I omitted the person's name, but I think this could be great for us. And anyone who is just joining right now, we have a recording, so you can kind of revisit the first part, yeah, so this is just the demonstration. So Irene said it felt short. I almost finished answering all the questions. That's amazing. I think if you can answer all of the pre-writing questions in 10 minutes, it's like you've already made a ton of progress during that time. I think another thing, I don't know if folks are familiar with like Pomodoro like videos, but on YouTube there are like some really fun ones, and it's kind of nice to just have an accompaniment. If you feel comfortable listening to music while you work and think that helps you focus, Brain FM is also a really helpful tool, and you could set it for like an amount of focus time. So like 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, etc. And it's just, I found it useful, especially for a writing context. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. And I just wanted to kind of show one, an artist statement. So the way that I would approach someone who already has one, so I think Lee was the one who mentioned that there's like kind of one that you're not happy with, but it already exists. So what I would say is using kind of like the different sections of the draft phase. So the first 25%, second 25%, third, etc. Just kind of like break down what the statement looks like once you put those ratios in, like, and then kind of see, is there repetition? Are there holes? Are there things missing, etc. So, I just kind of like, just kind of like reminding myself what I'm looking for. Like the third part is kind of like the why, concepts, themes, and then the fourth is like the takeaway. And they don't have to be like perfectly equal across the board, but I think it's just helpful to see like, is there like a huge kind of like uneven split between the way that I talk about like why I make the work versus how, and do I want to add more detail, etc. Okay, so first I kind of like divided into different sentences. And I think another thing that, you know, obviously this is like pulled from the internet just to kind of like respect anonymity, but then, you know, it was like from a like worksheet. So it's not, we're not like kind of invading someone's privacy by doing this, but we can just like kind of think about like what our suggestions might be for the person. So, okay, my artwork takes a critical view of social, political, and cultural issues. Pretty vague, but I guess I would fall under an overview. Often referencing American history, my work explores the varying relationships between popular culture and fine art. This is kind of like in between overview and how. Having engaged subjects as diverse as the civil rights movement, Southern rock music, and modernist architecture, my work reproduces familiar visual and oral science, arranging them into new conceptually layered installation. So this is a bit about how, but, you know, thinking about the subjects, I would kind of just like start putting them into here. And, you know, this is not going to be like the final like restructure, but just kind of seeing like how, like, what are we covering? What are we not? And what do we have questions about as a group too? While I use a variety of materials and processes in each project, my methodology is consistent. Although there may not always be material similarities between the different projects, they are linked by recurring formal concerns and through the subject matter. So this feels pretty repetitive to me, right? Like, you know, this person talks about a variety of materials and processes. There may not always be material similarities. Like, I'm just wondering, you know, kind of, do we need both? And we'll put it in the right section. And then the subject matter of each body of work determines the materials and the forms of the work. Again, it feels like 3 sentences that are kind of saying similar things. So maybe like just in like determining like which part of this feels most important to the process and to the work. Okay. And then each project often consists of multiple works, often in a range of different media grouped around specific themes and meetings. Okay. So it feels like all of these are kind of saying pretty similar things. Like, it just feels like we're talking about multiples without actually getting into like, what are the multiples? What are the differences? During research and production, new areas of interest arise and lead to the next body of work. I guess it's technically a takeaway, but I think what we can see here is that, you know, like the how has like quite a bit of repetition, and also it talks kind of like more generally and vaguely about the work, but then we don't really get into like why are there so many different you know, like what are the link, like what are the formal concerns, what's subject matter links, are there specifics about how everything's connected? So just thinking about kind of like, you know, when we look at this here, you know, just for clarity. The second section takes up like the majority of it. And there's quite a bit of repetition. So just like working on that might be really helpful. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing right now. And I think, yeah, and I think another question that I would just ask before we move forward is if anyone kind of noticed anything like in this artist statement that did not cover like, you know, like the pre-writing phase. I think that's another thing that we can look at together is, you know, like what assumptions are we making like about the reader's existing knowledge? And it almost feels like we're assuming that the person knows about our work, and kind of how do we make it more specific so that someone who's not familiar can get a better understanding. And just thinking about like, what do you want the statement to say about you and your work? It feels pretty vague. And I can't tell if, you know, like when we talk about a critical view of social, political, and cultural issues, I'm just kind of like wondering where that criticality like kind of comes through. So, okay, I will stop sharing. Did any questions come up while we were doing that? Feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand. Okay. No questions or any comments also. If there were any learnings that you think could have been really helpful there. Okay.
I was just gonna say, I don't think I realized how repetitive it was until you broke it down. Like when I first read it, I didn't really notice that. And then I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, that's it's true. Like I think when we're reading it, sometimes it feels, especially when it's broken out, we're like, oh, that feels really separate. But then when you put it all together, it's like, oh, like how many times am I saying certain words? And you know, instead of getting deeper into the idea, sometimes it feels like we're just spreading it around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I also wondered like how specific, maybe this is too specific of a question, but like how specific should we get in terms of materials and our process? Like I didn't get a sense from that statement, like what the work was made of or what it might look like, or, and I don't necessarily like, I make red paintings. Like I'm assuming it can't get too specific, but like how specific would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think giving it kind of like a bit more of like a visual angle. Like, so I think just if there's something important about, if there is a material that you use often, or if there is like a scale that you work at, or if there are specific, yeah, I think just like figuring out how to make it more visual. It doesn't have to describe, obviously it's not going to describe every work that you make, but just thinking about overarching, like, is there anything that comes up as like a continuation? And I also think one thing that we'll do in kind of like this next part is we will kind of like look at the artist statement and then look at examples of work and see like, are there things in the work that we don't feel like we're getting? You know, like if it feels, and it doesn't have to be like representative fully, but just kind of if there's anything there that we can kind of bring out more. Yeah, so we'll go through that. But I think I kind of disagree with you that it just didn't feel like there was like a tactical sense of like what the work looks like or could look like. And yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And then, yes, Irene, definitely. It felt superficial because it felt just like almost as if this person was afraid to get into detail, right? And to like, I feel like they were afraid to kind of box themselves in by including details. So then it felt super vague and non-specific, and yeah, a bit superficial for sure. Okay, so Wendy, I'm not sure kind of, you know, so we were prepared for like, you know, anywhere from a couple folks to like a much larger group. So I think, you know, we have a full, like almost, we have a full like 15 minutes to talk about this. We can do it in like a couple ways, like groups of 4, maybe. Yeah, feels like there's
yeah,
yeah.
I think 3 groups of 4 would be good.
Oh, I think there are yeah.
Yeah, because then it's 15, but that's including you, me, and Georgie also works for Q.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think 3 groups of 4 would be great. So I'm gonna set up the breakout groups, and then I will spend 20 minutes with each group.